Hello, I'm Bob the Booker, and welcome to my channel. And today I'm joined by Nathan Evans, and we're going to talk a little bit about his book here, One Last Song. Nathan, do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself?
Hello, Bob, and it's really lovely to join you. I'm one half of Incandescent, the publishing outfit. I'm the editor there. I've published a couple of collections of poetry previously. The first of those was longlisted for the Polari First Book Prize back in 2017. I live and work in London. I teach at London Met University on their creative writing degree, and I have, I believe, what they call is a portfolio career. So I do lots of different things. So I have directed theatre, worked as a cabaret performer, uh, um, a model, an actor, various different things. And the fiction writing is a very new thing. So this is my first long form fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. And I'm really excited. It's a book that I read and loved, and it's just been launched really recently. Do you want to tell us a little bit about One Last Song?
Um, my elevator pitch for One Last Song is always it's a bit like a beautiful thing for octogenarians. So beautiful thing is the Jonathan Harvey play slash film from the 90s, and that was the sort of feeling that I was um going for. Yeah, it's about two older gentlemen who meet in a care home, and at first they hate each other in classic romantic comedy fashion, and then they don't hate each other by the end. And it's, they're both, at the end of their life, and it's a bittersweet tale. And that's it, really. I mean, it's having people seem to be really enjoying it. That they find it very funny and also very moving. So I'm this has been great. It's been, it's been lovely to hear that feedback because that's exactly what I wanted. That was what I
Yeah.
aimed to do.
No, definitely. I don't think I've actually mentioned this to you, but I finished the last part of this book after finishing the finale of It's a Sin, which was a great double whammy. So I was on the train, just really, really feeling it. But exactly as you said, it's a book that's so full of. I mean, there are some really tender, really sad, and sort of more solemn moments, but there's so much joy and so much humor and fun in this book. And I think I remember you saying this book has sort of had sort of various lives in its sort of lead up to being here in fiction. I think it sort of started with various smaller pieces or smaller parts of it. What's that sort of process been like for it becoming sort of how it is now in the sort of fiction form?
Yeah, it's been a long and winding road, Bob. Um, so it started in 2010.
Mm,
2010, I started writing this one back when I was still in my 30s. Goodness. So I heard a documentary on Radio 4 about older LGBT people going into care homes and not being able to be themselves.
mm,
To go back in the closet because of various assumptions that had been made about them, prejudices they were experiencing from other residents, and also often from the staff, or sometimes
mm,
from the staff. Let's say that things have moved on that front. At that time, there was no sort of framework of advice on that front. I believe there is now within the care system, but there certainly wasn't in 2010. And so that got me thinking. I wanted to write something about that. I wanted to write something about an older person who had been an activist their
mm,
entire life, someone who was in the Gay Liberation Front and went into a care home and um, refused to be anything other than themselves.
mm,
And what resulted from that. I mean, obviously, the prejudice that they would be exposed to from some of the other residents and the staff, and then that developed into the story of, so that character is Joan, and the other character is Jim, and it developed into a love story between them. So Jim is a character who takes the opposite route. Jim is gay, but is very discreet, shall we say.
Hmm. Hmm.
So he's lived very discreetly with a long-term partner who's been dead for a while now, and Jim has early stage dementia. And when Jim goes into the home, because Jim passes, everyone has just assumed he's straight, and he hasn't challenged that in any way, shape, or form. Of course, Joan sniffs him out pretty quickly, uh, and so it's the story had a political motivation, but the that's not really, that's the backdrop to the story. But what emerged from that was this sort of love story between these two characters. So, which sort of illustrates the politics in a
Hmm.
way. Anyway, you asked me a question about the beginnings of it. So the first idea I had for this was in 2011. I wrote it as a film
Hmm.
script, and we had a reading of that in 2012, a private reading at Soho Theatre. Richard Wilson read Jim, Betty Bourne read Joan, various other, we had a cast of about 8 or 9, I think, for that. And then it was taken on by Film London. We were part of this sort of micro financing thing. My producer,
Hmm.
Ryan Mercer, and I. Nina Wadia was in that reading as well, so it was her husband that was producing it. Nina was playing the care home manager,
Right.
and um, and uh, and Chris New was playing the deputy manager, Chris New, who was in Weekend. So we couldn't raise the money. Basically, we went through all of these processes, and because I was a first-time director, I directed a lot of short films, but I'd never directed a feature film because of the subject matter. Sometimes, you know, uh, people are very risk averse. There's lots of
Mm.
money involved in film. The actors absolutely loved it. Lots of people who read it, the casting director who read it, really loved it. But I couldn't get enough people. Got some
Hmm.
people, but not enough people to come on board with the funding. So I then decided to rewrite it as a radio play. That went nowhere at all. Uh, Literally nowhere at all. Um, I mean, I submitted it for a few things, but it was just a no. So then I decided to rewrite it as a play. I mean, I suppose by this point, I sort of grown to love Joan and Jim.
Mm.
And I felt fairly, well, very passionately that I wanted to get this story out there. I wanted people to see. I knew the strength of the story and the characters,
Hmm.
even if the financing world wasn't playing along. So I rewrote it as a play for just 3 characters, and Joan, Jim, and Craig, the care assistant. And that was we had a staged reading of that at the King's Head Theatre in 2017, and then I got Arts Council funding to stage that a couple of times. Once site specifically at the Vauxhall Tavern,
Hmm.
with Lavinia Co-op playing Joan, and it was David Meyer playing Jim by that point. Nathaniel Campbell was playing Craig, and down in Brighton at the Marlborough Theatre. And again, that was it. So I tried to get the production transferred. No one would take it, etc., etc., etc. And so it died back again. I rewrote it as a short film that went precisely nowhere. And then Justin, my other half at Incandescent, um, had been for some time saying, well, why don't you write it as a novella? I mean, you could probably write it in a couple of weeks, blah, 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 blah. It took a bit longer than that, let me tell you. But anyway, he eventually persuaded me. Well, actually, what happened was lockdown happened. So suddenly there was time. So in lockdown, I wrote a collection of short stories, which will come out next year. And then as sort of as a way of learning how to write fiction, because I'd never done it. I'd written, well, as you can guess from that, I'd written a lot of scripts, plays,
Mm.
poetry, never actually written prose fiction. So the short story collection sort of was my learning curve.
Apologies. There we go.
We've got
We
an
c- we
audience.
do. There we go. He's clearly
Oh,
heard the lift or something. It's too
yeah.
too exciting for him.
So, uh, and then I wrote the novella, and I joined a writing group at that point called Leather Lane Writers, and workshopped it with them. So it probably that started in 20. I don't think I started it till 21. So that was a 3 year process, that final stage, and a lot of the story is the same as the feature film. It's slightly different to the
Mhm.
play, but it's the same as the feature film. It has the same core characters, though they'd mutated a bit by that point. And some extra characters came in the writing of the novella. And obviously, not obviously, but if you read it, um, I was able to explore a lot of backstory of the
Mhm.
characters in the novella, which wasn't there at all in the other incarnations, and that just sort of organically emerged in the writing process. So yeah, it's been a 14-year journey, but um,
Mhm.
the wonderful, I've never experienced this before, of the thing of putting a book out into the world. I put poetry collections into the
Right.
world. Nobody reads the poetry collections, or hardly anyone reads poetry collections. So it's very different putting a work of
Mm.
fiction out, because it does seem that people want to read it,
Right.
and I was, my instinct was right in that people do fall in love with Joan and Jim. So
Mm.
and also are moved by the politics behind
Yeah.
this as well, and that. So um I suppose I've been proved right in the long run, in that it is now, in the last 10 days since it's been out, it's probably, that story has been engaged with by more people than ever
Yeah.
previously engaged with it, because the theatre shows had quite small audiences. They were sold out, but there were quite small venues.
Sure.
um, yeah, so that was a long answer to your question.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's really interesting because I think so much of that bleeds into the book in the sense that it feels very filmic. That the dialogue is very snappy in a way that I could kind of imagine it on stage. So I think it kind of has this real quality of sort of feeling very alive in a way that sometimes it's quite hard to kind of convey that very. I could almost see things being slid off stage as they change set to kind of come back to the next scene or whatever in the most beautiful way. I thought it was incredibly well captured in terms of those voices of those two characters, and that's kind of a big part of it. And I think you sort of um, touched a bit on this as well, but these are sort of two characters that we don't often get in a lot of sort of fiction. Really, we don't tend to get as many older characters, particularly older characters in relationships, particularly older queer characters in relationships. And so I was sort of really pleasantly surprised to sort of have these sort of voices that you don't often get. How was that sort of process for you in terms of sort of getting inside the heads of these characters, and why was it sort of important for you to show those two characters?
um I couldn't, it's such a long time ago, I can't tell you exactly why those two characters emerged. um I mean, Joan was inspired by a number of older queer people that I know, and then sort of grew from that and became very much himself.
Mm.
Jim is a fiction. It's completely a fiction. Um, I suppose what I was imagining when I was writing them, I wanted Joan to be very sort of outraged, gay
Mm.
liberation front, that sort of, to represent that, the Peter Tatchell of kind of, of gay politics, if you will, and Jim to be more like the sort of Ian McKellen Stonewall
Right.
story of. So I think that helped me imagine my way into the characters. But I mean, of course, in the way of most author creations, probably they're both different versions of me in
Right.
in a way. Joan's my rather anarchic show off side, and Jim's my inner grumpy old man who comes out actually quite a lot these days. But yeah, um, has that
It
answered your
has, yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean I love that because I think it's often a thing where, you know, writers are, I suppose, often asked about how autobiographical things are, and I'm kind of intrigued by them both sort of occupying bits of you in your head. And particularly, I love Joan's kind of the sort of absolute energy and life force of that, of the way that Joan speaks. It's just so um it's funny actually because it's sort of early on I was like, oh, this kind of fun Quentin Crisp sort of style thing, and then you reference Crisp himself, and there's something so not necessarily lost, but there's something so particular about that, the sort of vernacular of Joan that you don't often hear quite as much, but it's so beautiful. It's so such a sort of specific way of speaking. How was it for you, sort of inhabiting Joan's world to do that voice? Because that voice is so consistent and so well flashed out throughout the book that, I was sort of wondering almost, did you write all of Joan in one go and then write all of Jim to kind of stay in those sort of lanes and in those worlds? Or, how did you manage to balance those two?
No, I didn't actually. So, I mean, because of the way that it was written, I had the story arc, so
Of
I
course,
knew
yeah.
what would happen in every chapter. I I knew the story. I had to break it down into chapters, the action that would happen in each chapter. I had to tweak things around because I knew I wanted it to alternate between the two voices, which meant I wanted to be with either Joan or Jim for certain
Mm,
key episodes, and so I had to juggle some of it around. But that was the first bit, and by the time I'd done that, I knew I had my chapter layout. It did change in
mm,
later on a little. Chapters were added, etc. But then I wrote it in sequence from chapter one right through to the end. So that meant
right.
alternating Joan and Jim's voices, and I think because I knew them so well,
Mm,
by that point they sort of arrived, and I didn't struggle with the alternation between them. And in a way, it was almost because I knew the story, and I had at least 50% of the dialogue, probably about 50%. Quite a lot of the dialogue
mm,
was written for the book, but then I, in a way, I could almost free write the first draft, which is
right.
where the backstory and everything emerged from, because it allowed my brain to just sort of go inside their heads. Though with
Mm,
Joan's very much in first person, we're very there in Joan's head because that's
yeah.
Joan. Jim's in third person, which differentiates them. We're a little
Yeah.
further away from Jim, but then that's Jim.
Yeah.
He's a cooler character, and that seemed to suit them well. I did a little bit of experimenting early on with those which voices they would use, but that fell into place
Mm.
fairly easily.
Interesting, especially with such a sort of a broader cast of supporting characters, many of whom, obviously Joan and Jim are sort of right up front and center, so we get a lot more of their voices. But I'm intrigued because the sort of supporting cast that you sort of referenced, and it seems like Craig has been the kind of linchpin in all of the rest of, every time even when it was only a three-person show, Craig was the one you kept, or, when it was with a sort of bigger cast, that one kind of character seems to have been there. What was sort of, I suppose, sort of in terms of creating the other characters around Joan and Jim, what was the sort of process, or sort of what did you want to have kind of included in that?
Well, there had to be. So the Craig is a young uh, care worker, black. Um, I think I can't remember how. I think he's late 20s.
Mm,
So he's the deputy manager. So in terms of the play, there had to be one other person to interact with, and he's the one who goes into their rooms because he delivers
mm,
their pills, etc., etc. So that was the natural choice for that. and the reason that he was important was a sort of counterpart to the other two in terms of where we are now
Mm.
in terms of LGBTQ plus politics, in that Craig sort of doesn't really think about it. It's just
Yeah.
it's not really been a struggle for him. Not, and Joan finds that very hard to comprehend
Yeah.
because everything has always been a struggle for Joan, and
Yeah.
indeed the the struggle is habituated in Joan, so much so that even when things aren't a struggle, it's a struggle for Joan. Joan has to struggle. Joan has to fight the battle,
Mm.
even when there is no battle to be fought anymore. And that can happen. People get frozen in a sort of a mindset because that was the time that formed them. Because when
Yeah.
Joan was Craig's age, it really was a battle.
Yeah.
Everything was a battle. To be visibly queer in the way that Joan would have been was a daily, hourly battle.
Yeah.
So Craig was important to show that sort of counterpoint between where we are now and where we were then. And it sort of allowed me, in a way, to honour queer elders as well and the battles that they had won and show those discrepancies. And actually, both Craig and Joan learned from each other.
Mm.
And that was how the characters fell into place and chose, I suppose, all of them to greater and lesser extents learn from each other and influence each other. So Joan has a great influence on Jim, but Jim also, actually more so in the novella than in any of the other forms, has an influence on Joan, and Joan has to adapt and learn stuff about compromising and about being in a relationship that Joan has never learned before.
Mm.
So that was important. The care home manager Rashida was has always been sort of the other key figure in that initially she's pretty prejudiced against Joan. Let's face it. She's culturally she doesn't. Joan is just a complete shock to her, and she doesn't. She's not rude, but she's kind of. Well, she kind of is rude, but in a sort of very sort of
Yeah.
professional
Right.
way. But I mean, Joan can tell that Joan picks up on that immediately,
Yeah.
and it's a battle with her. And but she learns and adapts and moves on, and actually Joan does as well, and realizes that by the end that he's experienced his own prejudice against Rashid as a Muslim. So he has his own internalized prejudice that actually he has to overcome
Mm-hmm.
by the end. So they learn from each other, and that prejudice is prejudice basically by the end. And then the other characters develop less. It was important for there's a character called, I've forgotten what her name is, Mary, who's a friend of Joan. It's important for Joan to have an ally within
Mm.
the home that he loses
Yeah.
quite soon, which kind of leaves him vulnerable,
Yeah.
and which is where the friendship from Jim develops. And there is Joan sort of has a sidekick called Gladys, who's a bit younger than Joan. Gladys Neye Gareth. So as Joan is as was done quite a lot in the 60s, 70s, particularly. Joan is a man who took a woman's name and just stuck
Yeah.
with it, as it's sort of a calling card.
Yeah.
And Gladys similarly. And Gladys is a bit younger than Joan, and Gladys is Joan's longest suffering friend, and Gladys does suffer a lot. But yeah, Gladys makes a few
Mm-hmm.
appearances in the book, as does Jim's niece towards the end, which was a new character from the novella that emerged from the writing group workshops that I did. It seemed necessary to bring in that character, and there's some learning and stuff that goes on there as well. Yeah, and there are generally speaking, the other residents are very opposed to Joan or just don't know how to
Yeah.
handle. Uh, and to some extent, all of them, greater or lesser, sort of come round by the
Mm.
end. Um, and so, you know, well, what happens when a lifelong activist goes into a care environment?
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of like the best possible version of what could happen, in that Joan changes the world around him, because
Mm.
his world has become very small,
Yeah.
as happens with older people. And of course, as a queer elder, the same with Jim. Most often there are no kids,
Yeah.
and often, or sometimes, with people of Joan's generation. So Joan is touching 80, Jim is a bit over 80. Um, their family connections have been cut because they might have been disowned by family back in the 50s
Mm.
or whatever, when they were younger, and so there's no connections at all, and so they're reliant on their adopted family, friends, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, with Joan lost a lot of friends, to that other pandemic back in the 80s and 90s. And so Joan has ended up quite isolated, really. And so Joan really is thrown at the mercy of the care system, as is Jim, in a lesser. Jim is wealthier than
Yeah.
Joan, and so is less vulnerable in that respect, but still finds himself very isolated, which is why he ends up in the care home, because he's experiencing
Mm.
the beginnings of dementia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I think that's such a beautiful ways to sort of honor that sort of generation, exactly as you sort of mentioned, his Jones sort of constant having to feel that everything's a battle is really born out of something very true, right? And I think there's something really so profound about having a character like Joan, who is so unapologetic, so unbelievably and unapologetically themselves in every moment of their life, that I think really, I mean, it's something that we see coming up quite a lot, with a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of queer people entering the care system for the first time, and particularly that generation for whom, yeah, exactly, so much of the rest of their life is sort of, they've not got the same security that many other people from their generation might have had, um, and it's really eye opening. I thought it was really beautifully rendered in how Joan is this sort of this figure who is um, so ready to battle at any time, but just has these moments of just really profound vulnerability and sort of loneliness of just, being sat in that room trying to work out what on earth he does next. I thought it was so beautifully rendered, and particularly sort of how he then interacts with someone like Jim, who I think at first he doesn't really understand. Right, he sort of comes up against him as sort of this figure of, well, where were you in the 70s and 80s? What were you doing? Like, we were all out here doing this thing. Where were you? And I thought it was so fun to
Well, he was
watch
at
their
home
little
hemming his
interactions.
curtains, wasn't he? And like watering his pot plants with his,
Right.
with his partner. That's what Jim was doing. Jim didn't even
Yeah.
care about any of
But
that.
I thought that was such an interesting thing to bring into the book. And I think obviously it's kind of inherent in a bit of who they both are and in their relationship. But I thought you captured that really beautifully, about just sort of the various ways that Jim, I think, struggles to kind of imagine how he ever could have been out on the front lines. He sort of, for him, that was almost, that felt so alien and so other, in the same way that Joan cannot understand him. But exactly like you said, I think there's something really beautiful about the way they sort of come together. And again, without ruining any sort of plot points later in the book, this is something we don't often get, these sorts of relationships, at least through a kind of queer lens, sort of explored quite a lot in literature or in films and TV. And I suppose sort of more broadly, you know, so easily, this could have been a different age of characters or a different set of circumstances. Were there moments where you sort of considered changing any aspect of who they were, or did they kind of crystallize quite strongly as sort of Joan and Jim kind of fairly early on?
No, not really. I mean, details changed, as I mentioned.
Mm,
Jim has a niece who came in, so his sort of family circumstances changed. I think probably Jim involved more in the
mm,
novella than Joan did because we get all the backstory about his
yeah.
partner or glimpses of the backstory about his partner. We
Mm,
never go into a backstory, but we get little snippets of it. We pick up a picture as we go through. And that was never really there in any
yeah.
previous version. So he developed more, I think. Joan sort of arrived. I mean, Joan just arrived.
Joan is a force of nature. Yeah, you can, I feel like Joan is this sort of ghost, sort of possessing, kind of like sort of possessing you in that sense of. I can totally imagine Joan refusing to sort of stop until Joan is ready.
Mm.
You know, uh, yeah, just such a beautifully rendered character. I think I just sort of I feel like I both sort of know a Joan and am terrified of the idea of Jones existing in the world. It's sort of this beautiful sort of dichotomy of sort of I've met Joan. I'm nervous. Um,
Yeah. I know quite a few Jones. In fact, as I said, I'm probably one myself, and um, I love Jones, but they're
mm,
hard.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And is there sort of do you sort of see almost sort of going back in terms of obviously it sort of started as sort of potentially as a film or stage being on stage. Do you sort of see now that the novella's out there sort of potentially revisiting some of those bits and sort of Joan on sort of Jim and Joan on stage again or sort of or do you sort of does that now sort of live more in the kind of novel form? Do you think?
I think I think I've done my job
Yeah.
now. Um, and unless someone commissioned me to write a script,
Hmm.
I ain't going to go there again now.
Yeah.
I would love it um, if the novella, I don't really see it as a stage play. I think it could make a great TV one or two parter
Yeah.
because it's I think possibly more so than a film actually because I think it's basically all set in one location. Okay, you've
Yeah.
got depends how much you use of the backstory, and if, I mean, in a film you would have less scope to do that, but essentially it's all in one location,
Hmm.
um, and um, and would be quite realizable. But also, I think when I was writing this story, it's funny. I always wanted I didn't want this to be a story that just youngish, trendy, queer people watched. I
Yeah.
wanted my auntie to be able to watch it. I wanted, in and when coming to writing the novella in the publishing industry, there's this archetype called Susan, who's this sort of every woman that ostensibly
Right.
books are kind of directed towards. And is it for Susan? Does Susan Susan's
I
ever
love
so
this.
nice, but she needs to know that it's for her. This was referenced in this report called Rethinking Diversity in Publishing, which came out in 2020.
Right.
Um, and I wanted Susan to be able to read this book, and bits of it are might kind of shock Susan, and maybe she might
Yes.
quite enjoy that, but it would still be and it would take Susan on that journey, and I think
Yeah.
it does. A number of
Yeah.
Susans have read the book and have loved it. So um, that's so I was exploring that because I think it would work on television. I think
I think so. Yeah.
it is done. It's kind of classic British, bittersweet, Mike Lee-ish kind
Mm.
of territory, really. So I think it would work well in that context. So I'd love it.
Mhm.
Any TV producers out there?
Susans of the world, find your local TV producer if you're not one
Yeah.
yourself.
Yes.
Um, uh, no, I mean absolutely. I think exactly that. I mean, as I was reading it, it felt I kind of had a sort of actually pretty much a two-parter kind of thing in my head of how I envisioned it. I sort of could very much see it as a sort of television thing. It just, I mean, sort of like I was saying earlier, the dialogue kind of has that snappiness to it, and I think obviously someone like Joan is just fantastic for one-liners anyway. But uh, it's yeah, it has that very much that feel I think to it anyway, and just a glorious, glorious book. And I mean, how has it been now since the launch? I mean, it's sort of what yeah, like 10 or so days since the launch at time of filming. How's the reception been for it so far?
It's been good. It's been really good. As I said, it's a first for me. So we had some lovely endorsements in advance, which was great. You know, some really amazing endorsements from amazing people, which was great. But the thing of people posting little reviews on social
Mm,
media or on online in some way, or sending me messages or whatever, um, that's been very rewarding, to get that sort of feedback that people are really generally are really warming to it and enjoying it. So it's going well. It's selling steadily. We're getting some interest from festivals and things like that.
nice.
So
Mm,
I'm going down to Brighton next week to do an event at the library there with Neil Bartlett. So I'm going to be asking him all about the Disappearance Boy, which
mm,
you talked about him with before. He's going to be asking me all about One Last Song. And then I'm going to Hastings Book Festival beginning of March. I think it's the 4th. That's only just been confirmed today, to do an event down there, sort of in conversation with the director of the festival, Wayne, and which is in Hastings. Well, it's St Leonard's actually, the gay bar there, which is called Forbidden Fruit. Um, and there's more information on that on the Hastings Book Festival site. That's a free event. Actually, the Brighton event is free as well, but it's already sold out. It's sold
nice.
out in seconds.
Very good. We like to
Um,
hear this.
so, and then I've been asked to do a romance festival in
Oh, wow.
June at some
Nice.
point, which will be interesting. So um, I mean, just that's just so new for me, and so I
Yeah.
don't. I mean, it will be interesting,
Yeah.
actually. Uh, yeah, be interesting to see how that pans out. So there are some events coming in. Hopefully there will be more.
Fab. Well, all the very best with everything with it. Very exciting that this book is out in the world. And I do, yeah, do urge people listening to go and read it. I
Oh,
think
I
it's a.
forgot as well. Sorry,
Oh
another
yeah,
one
yeah, please.
I'm doing Polari
Mm,
in London, the London Polari. Polari in Peckham, in fact. That
nice.
is March. Oh, it's the 20 something of March, but if you look on the Polari Salon website, then it is there. Yeah.
Super. Thank you. And yeah, all the very best with all the events and everything else. What is currently what are you reading or what have you read recently that you've really greatly enjoyed?
So I read a mixture of fiction and poetry. So the book that I've literally just finished yesterday was Kostya
Oh,
Salarkis's. That's really difficult with the possessive on the end.
Reclaim?
Recling by
Lizzie just on
Kostya
my table over here. Yeah.
Salarkis. It's much easier without the extra S, which I loved. So Kostya has read for us at Bold,
Mm,
which is the queer poetry soiree which Incandescent produce and which I host. Uh, I think it's a wonderful collection. So I literally just finished that. And probably my next read will be, it's interesting. I'm one of a number of poets, queer poets, who are publishing their first fiction in
right.
LGBT History Month in February. So Andrew Macmillan has got
Yes.
Pity out. I'm probably the least known poet with a new fiction out. So yeah, Andrew Macmillan's a pity, but we're going to the launch of Joelle Taylor's The Night Alphabet on, I think it's next Friday. So
Yeah.
probably that will be my next read. I'm really looking forward to reading that one because I love Joelle's poetry. So I'm really interested to read her first novel. So that will probably be the next one. I think that's a big one. So that might take a while.
No, so Joelle Taylor's, but I mean, yeah, absolutely. I at a couple of events, I think including actually an incandescent bold event, I saw Joelle Taylor read from Kunto, and still am blown away by what she does in that collection. So um yeah, very excited to read the novel of it. I recently read Pity by Andrew Macmillan, which
Oh, have
I
you read it?
which
Have you read
which is just beautiful,
it?
so clever. Also including some incredibly well thought out drag names that are kind of minor strike related,
Yeah.
which is a niche.
It's
But
interesting because, and contrary to Joelle's, I went into Gaze the Word the other day, and because Pity is now on the shelves, it's
mm,
just released. It's actually not, probably in paperback form. It's not really any longer than mine. It's quite
yeah,
short, isn't it? It's very much. I was speaking to Erica at Gillingham at the
mm,
desk in Gaze the Word, and she was saying, yes, it's very much a poet's. I mean, she was loving it, but she says, yes, it's very much a poet's novel. It's kind of quite distilled and quite. I'm really looking forward to reading that one as well. I mean, I love Andrew's poetry, so and I love Andrew. He's great.
but no, absolutely. I think again, one of the bold events with Incandescent, I saw Andrew Macmillan read, and he read one of my favorite poems ever. I think Blood, which I just think is one of the most staggering things. And I had a chance to very quickly chat to him after the. So he had an event at Foyles recently where he was interviewing Edouard Louis about
Yeah,
his new book,
yeah,
um, and sort of gushed at him very briefly. I managed to avoid fully going into how much I love his poetry, but yeah, I think Pity is a really good fun one. It's really interesting to see this sort of thing of writers, doing a new form, and particularly, yeah, recently poets sort of writing more fiction. But I think in past years, there have been quite a few novelists who have suddenly released poetry collections and things like that. So it's really interesting to see those things work along. And yeah, I think Joelle Taylor's one I've heard is exceptional. So I'm very excited for this.
yeah.
Anyway, before these boys completely attack each other again, thank you so much for joining
Thank
me,
you, Bob.
and for chatting about your book. I wish you all the very best with
Thank
one last
you.
song, and I do. Hang on, what are you doing? Oh my gosh. Anyway, I wish you all the very best.
It's fine. The dogs have picked up on the comedy vibe of
They
One Last
have.
Song. So
They are the
this
Jim and
this
Joan
video
of.
is going to have its comedy moments. So it's fine. It's all in keeping.
There we go. Thank you. Well, thank you again so much for joining me, and yeah, take care. All the very best with one last song.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Bye bye.